The morning they came to take the farm, the sky was the color of a bruise. Not the kind of bruise that fades in a few days. The kind that settles deep into the muscle, into the bone. The kind a man carries long after the skin goes back to normal. Caleb Hurst stood on the porch of the house where he was born, where his father was born, where his grandfather had driven the first fence post into red Oklahoma earth with nothing but a sledgehammer and a stubborn will. And he watched three men in suits walk up the gravel path like they owned the place. Because, as of that morning, they did. He hadn't slept. He'd spent the night sitting in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, listening to the house breathe around him, the creak of the floorboards in the hallway, the sound of wind pressing against the old storm windows, the distant moan of cattle that weren't his cattle anymore, not legally, not since the bank had stamped the last paper, and a judge somewhere in Tulsa had signed his name without ever once setting foot on this land. The tallest of the three men had a clipboard. He extended his hand toward Caleb with the practiced politeness of someone who had done this many times before and had learned to feel nothing about it. "Mr. Hurst, I'm sorry for the circumstances." Caleb didn't shake the hand. He looked past the man, past the rusted mailbox at the end of the drive, past the old elm tree his mother had planted the year she married his father. The leaves were already turning, though it was only September. The drought had done that, pulled the green right out of things months too early, like the land itself had given up before the season was finished. He thought about his father, who had died 2 winters ago believing the land would stay in the family. He thought about the loans taken out to survive 3 consecutive dry years. He thought about the morning his wife, Dana, had sat across from him at that same kitchen table and told him she couldn't do it anymore. The debt, the uncertainty, the slow drowning of it all. She had taken their daughter, May, to her sister's place in Wichita. That was 4 months ago. He hadn't spoken to either of them since. The tall man cleared his throat gently. Caleb picked up his duffel bag from beside the door. He had packed it the night before. 1 change of clothes. His father's old watch. A photograph. He didn't look back at the house as he walked down the steps. He was 41 years old, and he had nothing left. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked to his truck. A 98 Ford with cracked dashboard and a heater that only worked on the driver's side. He sat in it for a long moment with both hands on the steering wheel, watching the men in suits move through his yard like it was already something else, already a transaction, already a memory. Then he drove away, and the dust rose up behind him like the land itself was trying to forget he'd ever been there. Before continuing, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. He drove west. Not because he had a plan. Not because anyone was waiting for him. He drove west because that was the direction the truck was pointed when he pulled out of the driveway. And because west meant away, and away was the only destination that made any sense on a morning like that one. The Oklahoma panhandle stretched out around him like a flat, indifferent sermon. Miles of pale grass bent sideways in the wind. Abandoned grain elevators stood along the highway like monuments to things that used to matter. A hawk circled high above a fallow field, patient and unhurried, looking for something still alive down below. Caleb drove with the window cracked, even though the October air had a bite to it. He needed to feel something real against his face. Something that wasn't the suffocating stillness of that kitchen, that house, that life coming apart at every seam. He stopped for gas in a town called Felt, which was much more than a pump, a cinder block building with a handwritten sign that said cold drinks, hot food, and a water tower with the paint peeling off in long, curling strips. Inside, an old woman with silver hair and a floral apron handed him a styrofoam cup of coffee without him asking for one. "You look like you need it," she said simply. He didn't argue. He sat at the single counter stool and drank the coffee and stared at the laminate countertop and tried not to think about anything. The old woman moved quietly behind the counter, restocking shelves, humming something low and tuneless. A transistor radio on a shelf in the corner played a weather report. Dry conditions continuing through the week. No significant rainfall expected. Critical fire danger across the western counties. Same as it had been for 3 years. The drought hadn't been his fault. Any honest person in the county would have admitted that. The banker in Tulsa probably even understood it in some distant spreadsheet kind of way. But understanding didn't change numbers, And numbers were the only language that mattered when a man's back was against the wall, and the creditors had stopped being patient. He'd fought hard. That was the part nobody talked about. The part that didn't show up in any document or court filing. The years of 5 a.m. mornings. The fence repairs done alone in driving rain. The equipment he'd fixed with baling wire and ingenuity, because there was no money for parts. The calves he'd nursed through a brutal winter with nothing but hay, warmth, and stubbornness. He had fought for that land the way a man fights for something he believes is part of his own body. And it hadn't been enough. The old woman refilled his cup without asking. "You running from something or toward something?" she asked, not unkindly. Caleb wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the warmth seep into his palms. "Don't rightly know yet," he said. She nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable answer, like she'd heard it before and understood there were seasons in a man's life when that was the most honest thing he could say. He left a $5 bill on the counter and walked back to the truck. The highway ahead disappeared into a vanishing point somewhere between earth and sky, straight and unforgiving as a ruled line. He pulled back onto the road and kept driving, the truck engine humming its low, familiar note, the radio picking up nothing but static out here where the signals gave up and the silence took over. Somewhere around the New Mexico border, he pulled off onto a dirt road and sat there while the sun went down. The sky turned colors he had no words for, deep amber bleeding into violet, into a red, so dark it looked almost like someone had been wounded up there above the Mesa line. The kind of sunset that didn't come for a man so much as remind him how small he was, how old the world was, how little any one life's troubles registered against that much sky. He slept in the truck that night with his jacket pulled over him, and he dreamed of green fields that no longer belonged to him. He spent 3 weeks moving like a ghost through small towns. Tucumcari, Santa Rosa, a stretch of nothing along Route 60 where the only signs of life were a rusted water tank and a hand-painted cross stuck in the gravel shoulder, faded flowers at its base. He picked up 2 days of work at a feed store in Clovis, stacking bags of alfalfa pellets until his shoulders burned and his hands cracked from the dry air. The owner paid him in cash, no questions asked. The way men in those towns understood, sometimes that was the kindest thing you could offer a stranger. He slept in the truck, mostly. Occasionally at a roadside motel where the sheets smelled like industrial detergent and the parking lot lights buzzed all night like something trapped. He ate at diners where the coffee was strong and the portions were honest and the waitresses called everyone honey without meaning anything particular by it. He called Dana once, from a payphone outside a laundromat in Portales. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording was cheerful and businesslike, the voice she used for people she didn't know well. He stood there holding the receiver for a moment after the beep, listening to the silence asking something of him, and then he hung up without saying a word. What would he have said anyway? He thought about May every single day. She was 9 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and a stubborn jaw, and she used to follow him around the farm on Saturday mornings like a small, determined shadow, asking questions about everything. Why do the cows sleep standing up? Why does the sky turn green before a tornado? Why do you always whistle the same song? Daddy. He didn't even know the name of the song. It was just something that had come out of him since he was a boy, some melody without origin or title, just a thing his body did when his hands were busy and his mind was somewhere quiet. He missed her with a specific, physical weight, like something had been removed from his chest, and the surrounding tissue hadn't figured out yet how to close around the absence. By the time he crossed into Texas, the landscape had shifted into something harder and more elemental. The high plains of the Llano Estacado spread out flat and vast in every direction, the sky enormous overhead, the horizon so far away it seemed theoretical. Cattle grazed behind barbed wire fences that ran for miles without a single post out of place. Pump jacks nodded slowly in the distance like iron birds feeding from the earth. He stopped for the night outside a small town called Floydada and ate a sandwich in the truck cab, watching the last light drain from the western edge of the world. The wind had picked up, carried with it the smell of dry grass and something faintly sweet he couldn't identify. Maybe mesquite, maybe just a particular perfume of Texas earth after a long dry spell. He was almost out of money. He had maybe $60 left, a quarter tank of gas, and no particular direction. For the first time since leaving Oklahoma, the reality of a situation settled over him with its full weight. He wasn't just passing through a hard stretch. He was a 41-year-old man with no address, no income, no land, and no clear reason to drive any further in any direction. He sat with that for a long time. The crickets started up around him as full dark came on, that thick chorus of sound that filled the Texas night like audible warmth. Somewhere out in the field beside the road, something moved through the dry grass. A coyote, maybe, or just the wind finding a new path. Then his phone buzzed on the seat beside him. A number he didn't recognize. Texas area code. He stared at it for 2 full rings before picking up. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's more where this came from. This Caleb Hurst? The voice on the other end was older, graveled and unhurried. The kind of voice that had spent decades outdoors. Who's asking? Name's Roy Denton. I got your number from Bill Atchison over in Clovis. Said you did good work at his feed store. Said you know cattle. Caleb straightened slightly in the seat without quite realizing he'd done it. I know cattle, he said carefully. I got a place outside Floydada, about 9 miles east of where you're sitting right now. If Bill's directions were worth a damn. A pause. I need a hand. Someone who can work. Not someone who needs hand-holding or explaining to 3 times. I'm 73 years old, and my hip replacement didn't take the way the surgeon promised it would. And I got 80 head of Angus that need tending and a property that's starting to show what happens when one man tries to do everything alone. Caleb looked out the windshield at the dark field. What's the pay? Room, board, and $400 a week to start. Cash. If you work out, we talk again in 30 days. It wasn't much, but it was more than $60 and an empty horizon. I can be there in 20 minutes, Caleb said. Roy Denton's place was called the Crosshatch Ranch, a name painted in faded black letters on a wooden sign, hanging from a wrought iron post at the entrance to a long caliche drive. The headlights of the truck swept across the sign as Caleb turned in, and he had a moment, brief and irrational, where the name felt like something, like a word that meant more than it said. The main house was a low, wide structure of pale brick and dark wood, surrounded by a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on the east end. A single light burned in a front window. The outbuildings were set back behind it. A barn, an equipment shed, several pens connected by a maze of pipe fencing. The whole place smelled of hay and iron and manure and motor oil, the honest smell of a working ranch, and something in Caleb's chest responded to it involuntarily, like a compass needle swinging toward north. Roy met him on the porch. He was a tall man, thin in the way that old ranchers go thin, not frail, but stripped down to essentials, all the unnecessary parts worn away by decades of physical work and weather. He had a white mustache and eyes the color of well water, pale and clear and measuring. He looked Caleb over the way a man looks at a horse he's considering. You eat? He asked. Not much today. Roy nodded and held the screen door open. The kitchen was warm and cluttered and smelled of coffee and wood smoke. A cast iron skillet sat on the stove with the remnants of what had been beans and cornbread. Roy heated it without ceremony and set it in front of Caleb at a table covered in maps, receipts, and a veterinary catalog with pages folded back. Caleb ate, and Roy sat across from him with a coffee cup and said almost nothing, just watched, not in an unfriendly way, in the way of a man who had learned that you find out more about a person by watching them eat and rest than by asking them questions. After a while, Roy said, You lose something recent. It wasn't a question. Caleb kept his eyes on the plate. Farm. Back in Oklahoma. Bank took it. Roy was quiet for a moment. He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. My daddy lost his place in the 50s, he said. Drought took what the Depression left behind. He worked other men's land for 11 years before he put together enough to start over. He paused. He always said those 11 years were what made him worth a damn. Caleb looked up at him. Roy pushed back from the table. Bunkhouse is behind the barn. There's clean sheets on the bed. We start at 5:30. He said goodnight and went down the hall, and Caleb sat alone in the warm kitchen for a moment, listening to the house settle around him. For the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel like an accusation. The first month at Crosshatch was hard in the way honest work is hard. Not cruel, not defeating. Just a steady, cumulative weight of long days that started before the sun and ended after it. Days measured not in hours, but in tasks completed, problems solved, animals tended. Caleb rose each morning at 5, before Roy's kitchen light came on, and walked across the dark yard of the barn with his breath, making small clouds in the cold air and the stars still fully present overhead, bright and indifferent and magnificent. He learned the rhythms of the place quickly, which gate latch stuck in cold weather, which section of fence along the north pasture had a weak post that needed watching, which of the Angus cows had a tendency to separate from the herd and needed checking. He learned the particular sound the old John Deere made when the hydraulics were thinking about giving trouble, and he learned to address it before it became a crisis. The way a man learns to read the small warnings a living system gives before it breaks down entirely. Roy watched all of this from a careful distance. He wasn't a talkative man by nature, but he was an observant one. He noticed things and filed them away, and occasionally, at the end of a long day, he would say something brief and precise that let Caleb know he'd been seen. "You fixed that north post without being told," he said one evening, leaning on the fence rail watching the herd settle for the night. "Notice it leaning," Caleb said. Roy nodded slowly. Man who fixes what he notices without waiting to be asked, that's a particular kind of man. He didn't say what kind. He didn't need to. The land around Floydada had its own austere beauty that Caleb came to appreciate in those early weeks. The flat immensity of the Llano Estacado was nothing like the rolling red country of his Oklahoma childhood, but it had its own authority. The sky here was a dominant feature, enormous and theatrical, capable of extraordinary displays. Sunrises that set the entire eastern horizon on fire. Thunderheads building in the afternoon that climbed 40,000 feet and flickered with internal lightning, like something alive and thinking. Night so clear and so dark that the Milky Way appeared as a physical presence, a river of cold light overhead. He began to feel the ground under his feet again, not as ground. He was careful not to confuse that. He knew the difference between belonging to a place and working it, but there was healing in the work itself, in the daily negotiation with physical reality, in the simple transaction of effort and result that farming and ranching provided. You fed the animals, and the animals thrived. You mended the fence, and the herd stayed safe. You turned the soil, and something grew. The world responded to what you put into it, and that responsiveness, after months of watching everything he'd built collapse regardless of his effort, felt like a form of grace. He called Dana again in November. This time she answered. The conversation was short and careful, like two people walking across ice and testing each step. She asked where he was. He told her Texas. She was quiet for a moment, and then said May had started playing soccer and was apparently very fast, which didn't surprise him at all. He asked if he could talk to her. Another silence. Longer. "She asks about you," Dana said finally. "She asks why you don't call." The words landed with a precision that left him briefly unable to speak. "I'll call her Sunday," he said, "if that's all right." "Sunday's fine," Dana said, and then, just before she hung up, something softer moved through her voice. Something that might have been the ghost of the woman who used to sit beside him on the porch steps, watching summer, lightning on the far horizon. "Are you okay, Caleb?" He looked out the bunkhouse window at the dark ranch yard. The barn light casting a yellow square on the caliche ground, the stars beginning to appear one by one above the flat black line of the prairie. "I'm getting there," he said, and for the first time, he almost believed it. Comment below. Would you have had the courage to start over the way Caleb did? Let us know. December came in cold and dry, the way winters do on the high plains, without ceremony or gradual warning. One morning, the temperature simply dropped 20 degrees overnight and stayed there. The wind coming out of the northwest was thin, cutting edge that found every gap in a man's clothing and reminded him the panhandle offered no shelter from anything it decided to send your way. Caleb adapted. He layered up before dawn and worked through the cold the way his father had taught him. Keep moving. Keep your hands busy. Let the work generate its own warmth. He broke ice from the water troughs every morning. Checked on the pregnant cows Roy had separated into the south pen. Ran a heating lamp into the corner of the barn where two of the older animals had started showing signs of stress from the temperature drop. Roy watched him do all of this and said nothing, which Caleb had come to understand was its own form of approval. On Sunday mornings, he called May. Those calls became the fixed point around which the rest of his week quietly organized itself. Her voice on the phone was bright and immediate and full of the rapid-fire narration of a 9-year-old's life. Soccer practice, a science project about volcanoes, a girl at school named Brianna, who was sometimes her best friend and sometimes her worst enemy depending on the day, a book she was reading about horses that she described in more detail than any book report had ever required. He listened to all of it with a hunger he hadn't known he was capable of. He sat on the edge of the bunkhouse bed with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor, and he listened like a man drinking water after a long drought, careful and grateful and aware of exactly what he'd been missing. "Daddy," she said one Sunday in mid-December, "do you have a Christmas tree?" He looked around the bunkhouse. A single room with a cot, a dresser, a wood stove, and a window that looked out on the barn. "Not yet," he said. "You should get one, even a small one. It makes the place feel like somewhere." He thought about that phrase for days afterward. Makes the place feel like somewhere. The particular wisdom of children who haven't yet learned to say things less precisely. He found a small cedar in the draw behind the south pasture, crooked and half the size of a proper Christmas tree, and he cut it and stood in a coffee can fill with gravel in the corner of the bunkhouse and hung it with a strand of lights he bought at the dollar store in town. It looked ridiculous and imperfect, and it smelled exactly like every Christmas of his childhood. It made the place feel like somewhere. Roy came by the bunkhouse one evening that week to drop off a part catalog and stopped in the doorway when he saw the tree. Something moved across his face briefly. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "My wife used to put cedar in the house," he said. Said pine was for people who didn't know any better. It was the first time he'd mentioned a wife. Caleb waited, understanding instinctively that this was a kind of moment that required stillness. "Eleanor," Roy said, almost to himself, "passed 6 years ago. Cancer." He looked at the tree for another moment. "She would have liked that you put up a tree." He set the catalog on a dresser and went back out into the cold night, and Caleb sat in the small warm room with the cedar smell and the colored lights casting soft shapes on the wall, and he thought about Eleanor Denton, who had lived and loved and worked on this land, and was gone now. And he thought about what it meant that Roy had shared her name, and what it meant that a man could lose the person at the center of his life and still get up every morning at 5 and tend to 80 head of cattle, and keep the fences straight and the troughs clean. He thought about what that kind of endurance cost, and what it built. In January, Roy asked him to stay on permanently. Caleb said yes without hesitation. But somewhere beneath the relief of that stability, something else had quietly taken root. Something he hadn't allowed himself to name yet, because naming it felt presumptuous. Felt like getting ahead of what the land and time and hard work had not yet finished teaching him. The feeling was something like possibility, and it scared him almost as much as it moved him. Spring arrived the way it does on the Llano Estacado, not gently, but decisively, like a door thrown open after a long winter. The grass greened almost overnight along the draws and creek beds, that particular vivid green that only appears for a few weeks before the heat bleaches it back to gold. Meadowlarks returned to the fence posts and sang with a persistence that felt almost argumentative, as if they were making a case for something. The air smelled of turned earth and new growth and the faint sweetness of wildflowers pushing up to the caliche wherever they could find purchase. Caleb felt the shift in himself as much as in the land. He had been at Crosshatch 5 months. He knew the ranch the way he had once known his father's place. Not just the layout and the systems, but the personality of it, the particular way it behaved in different weather, the subtle signs it gave when something needed attention. He had become, without quite planning it, indispensable. Roy had acknowledged this in his characteristic understated fashion by raising his pay to $600 a week in February and saying only, "You've earned it," before walking back to the house as if the matter were entirely unremarkable. It was during the spring calving season that Caleb first met Nora Vasquez. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March in a white pickup truck with a magnetic sign on the door that read of Squez's large animal veterinary, Floydada and surrounding counties. Caleb was in the South Pen with a first calf heifer who had been laboring since before dawn and wasn't progressing the way she should. Roy had called a vet from a house and then appeared at the pen gate to tell Caleb help was coming, leaning on his cane with a particular grimace he wore when his hip was having a bad day. Nora came through the gate with a large kit bag over one shoulder and assessed the situation in about 4 seconds. She was somewhere in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back under a worn baseball cap, and she moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd been solving these particular problems for a long time and had no anxiety left about them. She knelt beside the heifer without preamble, spoke to the animal in a low, steady voice, partly in English, partly in Spanish, the words less important than the tone, and began her examination with calm, practiced hands. "How long has she been at it?" she asked without looking up. "Since about 3 this morning," Caleb said. "Calf's position wrong. Nothing serious. I can correct it." She glanced up at him briefly. "You want to help, or would you rather wait by the fence?" "I'll help," he said. She looked at him for just a moment longer than necessary, as if recalibrating something. "Good. Get down here, then." They worked together for 40 minutes. It was hard, close, unglamorous work, the kind that strips away any pretense very quickly and reveals exactly what a person is made of. Nora was precise and unflappable, and occasionally narrated what she was doing in that same low, steady voice, not for his benefit particularly, but as if thinking out loud was part of her process. Caleb followed her lead and anticipated where he could, and when the calf finally came, wet and folded and then suddenly, miraculously, breathing, they both sat back in the dirt of the pen and existed for a moment in the specific satisfaction of that outcome. The heifer turned immediately and began cleaning her calf with focused maternal devotion. "Good mama," Nora said quietly. Caleb watched the calf attempt its legs for the first time. That ancient wobbling struggle toward upright, that never got less remarkable no matter how many times a person witnessed it. "You're not from around here originally," Nora said, cleaning her hands with cloth from her bag. It wasn't quite a question. "Oklahoma," he said. "Been here since October." She nodded, absorbing this without pressing it. "Roy mentioned you," she said. "Said he finally found someone who worked like they meant it." Caleb felt something shift slightly in the air between them. Nothing dramatic. Just a small, quiet realignment, like a compass settling. "Roy's a good man," he said. "Best I know," she agreed. She packed her kit and stood and looked out over the south pasture, where the new grass was coming in thick along the fence line, and the morning light was doing something extraordinary to the flat landscape, turning it gold and amber and impossibly wide. "It gets into you," she said, almost to herself. "This country. Takes a while, but it does." She said goodbye to Roy at the gate and drove back down the Caliche Road, the white truck raising a thin line of dust against the blue morning sky. Caleb stood at the fence for a long time after she was gone. Leave alike to help this story reach more people who need it. She came back 3 weeks later for a routine herd check, and then again in May when one of the older bulls developed a respiratory infection that needed monitoring. Each visit followed the same professional pattern. Efficient, focused, unhurried. But somewhere within that pattern, conversation had begun to find its way in. Not forced, not performed. The natural kind that grows between two people who discover, gradually and without planning it, that they think about things in similar ways. He learned that she had grown up in Floydada, the daughter of a Mexican-American family that had farmed cotton on the south end of Floyd County for 3 generations, that she had left for Texas A&M on a scholarship at 18, the first in her family to go to university, and had spent 4 years feeling simultaneously grateful and displaced, never quite belonging to the world she was moving toward or the one she had left behind. That she had come back after veterinary school not because she had to, but because she had chosen to, which was a different thing entirely, and one she seemed to have made peace with in a way that Caleb found quietly admirable. He learned that she had been married once, briefly, to a man she described only as someone who needed more certainty than she could provide, and that the divorce had been mutual and sad in a particular way of things that failed not from cruelty, but from incompatibility. She had a small house on the east side of town, a dog named Pepper who rode everywhere in the truck with her, and a garden in the backyard where she grew tomatoes and chiles and herbs with the same methodical care she brought to everything else. She learned about him, too, in the gradual way he allowed. The farm in Oklahoma, the debt and the drought and the bank, Dana and May and the Sunday phone calls, the duffel bag and the $60 and the payphone in Portales where he'd hung up without speaking. He told her these things slowly, over multiple visits, never as confession or performance, but simply as the truth of where he'd come from and how he'd arrived at this particular fence post on this particular stretch of Texas plain. She listened without flinching and without offering the kind of easy consolation that would have felt like condescension. She asked precise questions when she had them, and once, when he'd finished describing the morning the men in suits had walked up his gravel drive, she was quiet for a long moment and then said, "That kind of loss doesn't just hurt. It reorganizes you, changes what you think you're capable of." He looked at her. "It did," he said. "I'm still figuring out what the new version looks like." She met his eyes steadily. "From where I'm standing, it looks like something worth figuring out." He didn't sleep well that night, but not from grief, from something else entirely. Something he hadn't felt in so long it took him a while to identify it correctly. It was a particular restlessness of a man who has something to look forward to. Meanwhile, something else had been quietly developing at Crosshatch that Caleb hadn't fully registered until Roy sat him down one evening in late May with 2 glasses of bourbon, and a particular expression of a man who's been thinking carefully about something for a long time. Roy's nephew, it turned out, had been expected to take over the ranch eventually, had been the assumed heir to 4 decades of Roy's labor and investment and care. But the nephew had moved to Houston 8 years ago and built a life in commercial real estate, and had made clear, in the careful indirect language families use for these conversations, that he had no intention of returning to Floyd County and no interest in cattle. Roy had known this for years. He had simply not known what to do about it. He poured bourbon into both glasses and pushed one across the table toward Caleb and looked at him with those pale, measuring eyes. "I've been thinking about the future of this place," Roy said. Caleb held the glass and waited. "I'm not a man who does things halfway," Roy continued. "And I'm not a man who lets something he built get sold off to a corporation or carved up for development because he didn't plan ahead properly." He paused. "I've been watching you for 7 months, Caleb." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the yard with its low, permanent murmur. "I want to talk to you about a partnership arrangement," Roy said. "A real one, with a path to ownership." The bourbon glass was warm in Caleb's hand. The words took a moment to fully arrive. And when they did, something in his chest cracked open, not painfully, but the way ground cracks open in spring when the moisture finally reaches deep enough. The way things break apart not to collapse, but to let something through. He didn't say yes that night, not because he didn't want to, but because he had learned, in the hardest possible school, what it costs to make large decisions from the emotional center of a moment rather than from the steadier place that only distance and sleep and honest reflection could provide. He had signed papers before without thinking clearly enough. He had trusted numbers that looked good on the surface without following them all the way down to where the risk lived. He wasn't going to do that again. Not even when the offer came from a man he trusted. Not even when everything in him was leaning forward like a compass toward true north. He told Roy he needed a week to think. Roy nodded like that was exactly the right answer. Caleb spent that week in a state of careful, deliberate consideration that felt almost physical in its intensity. He walked the ranch boundaries in the evenings after the day's work was done, following the fence lines through the long golden light of late May. Looking at the land the way you look at something you're trying to see honestly rather than the way you want it to be. He assessed what he knew and what he didn't. He thought about risk and about hope and about the difference between the two, which is smaller than most people admit. He called his cousin Jerry and Enid, who had a head for numbers and no stake in the outcome, and described the arrangement Roy had outlined. Jerry listened carefully and asked several sharp questions and then said, "Caleb, if this man is who you say he is and the land is what you describe, you'd be a fool to walk away from it." He talked to Nora about it, too, one afternoon when she came by to check on a cow that had been off her feed. They sat on the tailgate of her truck in the shade of the barn, Pepper the dog between them with his chin on Nora's knee, and Caleb laid out the whole situation plainly. She listened with her eyes on the middle distance, the way she did when she was thinking seriously about something. "What scares you most about it?" she asked. He considered this honestly. "Failing again," he said. "Building something and having it taken. Going through that twice." She was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark sang from somewhere along the fence line, its song bright and insistent in the warm afternoon air. "There's no arrangement man can make," she said carefully, That guarantees he won't lose something. The drought doesn't care about your contracts. Neither does sickness or the market or any of the other things that come sideways of life. She paused. But there's a difference between losing something you built and never building anything, because you were afraid to. He looked at her. My grandfather lost his first crop 3 years running, she said. Root rot, then hail, then a price collapse. Third time he almost quit. My grandmother told him if he quit, she'd find a man with more backbone. A small smile moved across her face. He planted a 4th year. That crop paid for the land. He farmed it for 40 more years. Caleb sat with that for a while, listening to the barn sounds and the wind and the meadowlark. Your grandmother sounds like a formidable woman, he said. She was terrifying, Nora said warmly. I try to be exactly like her. On Friday evening, he went to Roy's kitchen and sat across the table from the old man and said, I'd like to hear the full terms. Roy produced a folder from a kitchen drawer that suggested he had been ready for this conversation for some time. The arrangement was structured and fair, more fair than Caleb had expected. A 5-year partnership with Caleb managing daily operations and receiving a percentage of profits alongside a fixed monthly draw. At the end of 5 years, a purchase option on 40% of the property at a price already agreed upon, with a right of first refusal on the remainder when Roy eventually chose to step back entirely. It was not charity. It was not a gift. It was an opportunity, which is the only thing a man of Roy Denton's character would have offered, because Roy understood that a man who receives something he hasn't earned is diminished by the receiving. Caleb read every line twice. He asked his questions. Roy answered them without impatience. Then Caleb extended his hand across the kitchen table. Roy shook it once, firmly, and that was that night, alone in the bunkhouse. Caleb sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the wall for a long time. The cedar Christmas tree was long gone, but he could still faintly smell it if he imagined hard enough, or maybe that was just the wood of the walls. The particular scent of a room that had sheltered many seasons. He thought about his father, about the farm in Oklahoma, about the morning the men in suits had walked up the gravel drive, and he had carried a duffel bag down the porch steps and driven away into a bruise-colored sky with $60 and nothing else. He thought about how a man could lose everything and still, somehow, if he kept moving and kept working and stayed open to what the road offered, find himself sitting in a bunkhouse in Texas with a partnership agreement and a meadowlark on the fence post and a woman who quoted her grandmother like scripture. He pulled out his phone and called May. She answered on the second ring, breathless, fresh from soccer practice. Daddy, she said, guess what I did today? Tell me everything, he said, and he meant it with his whole heart. Before we reach the final chapter of Caleb's story, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. These stories are made for you. Summer came to Crosshatch like it owned the place. The heat settled over the Llano Estacado in July with a flat, pressing authority that turned the midday air into something almost visible, a shimmer rising from the caliche roads and the tin roofs and the pale grass of the pastures. The sky went from blue to white by 10 in the morning and stayed there until late afternoon when the thunderheads began building in the west, climbing and darkening and promising rain that sometimes came and sometimes didn't, which was a particular cruelty and beauty of this country, and always had been. Caleb worked through the heat the way he worked through everything now, steadily, without complaint, with the focused attention of a man who understands that the land doesn't accommodate a person's feelings about the weather. The partnership with Roy had been formalized through a lawyer in Lubbock in June, a quiet transaction witnessed by Roy's attorney, and signed on a Tuesday afternoon, without ceremony, which was exactly right. The most important things in a man's life, Caleb had come to believe, rarely announced themselves with fanfare. They arrived quietly and took root, and only revealed their full significance later, in retrospect, when you look back and understood what that ordinary Tuesday had actually been. He had told May about the partnership on their Sunday call. She had been quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was processing something seriously, that particular 9-year-old silence that preceded either a profound question or a completely unexpected observation. So it's going to be your farm, she said. Part of it, working toward all of it, takes time. Another silence. Then can I come see it? He had to clear his throat before he could answer. I'd like nothing more in this world, he said. The conversation with Dana that followed was longer and more complicated, conducted over 2 phone calls and 1 carefully worded text exchange, navigating the accumulated weight of everything that had broken between them with the kind of patient care that neither of them had managed to bring to it when they were still living inside the wreckage. Dana had moved on in ways that were her own and that he respected. There was a man in Wichita, someone steady and kind from what he could tell, and Caleb found that the bitterness he might have expected to feel about this was largely absent, replaced by something closer to relief. That May had stability, that Dana had found her footing, that the story he'd feared was a tragedy had turned out to be something more complicated and more survivable than that. May came to Crosshatch in August for 2 weeks. She arrived on a Friday evening in Dana's car, and when she climbed out and looked around at the flat immensity of the ranch, the pasture stretching to the horizon, the enormous sky, the cattle moving slow and dark against the gold grass, her expression was exactly what Caleb had hoped for, not overwhelmed, interested, hungry to understand it. She was taller than he remembered. Children do that. They save their growing for the months you're not watching. He hugged her, and she hugged him back with her whole self, the way children hug when they mean it completely. And he stood there in a ranch yard with his daughter's arms around him and the late sun turning everything amber, and he felt something settle inside him that had been unmoored for a very long time. Roy took to May immediately, in the gruff, undemonstrative way of old men who have forgotten how to be comfortable with children but find themselves charmed against their will. He taught her the names of the cattle. She taught him the rules of soccer with an authority that brooked no interruption. By the end of the first week, they had established a morning routine of sitting on the porch together with coffee. His real, hers mostly milk with a suggestion of coffee, watching the sun come up over the east pasture, while Caleb did the early feeding. Nora came by on a Wednesday in May's first week, and the two of them regarded each other with the careful mutual assessment of females who understand instinctively that first impressions matter. May said within 10 minutes of meeting her, "Your dog is the best dog I've ever seen." Nora said, "He thinks so too," and that was that. What grew between Caleb and Nora over those summer months was not the sudden combustion of people who mistake intensity for depth. It was slower and more considered than that, built from long conversations in the evening light and shared work and the gradual accumulation of small moments that don't seem significant individually, but together constitute something solid and real. She was not a woman who needed saving, and he was not a man offering to save her. They were two people who had each, in their own way, navigated loss and rebuilding, in particular solitude of the rural life, and who had arrived at a point where companionship felt not like necessity, but like genuine choice. He told her he loved her on a September evening, almost exactly 1 year after he had driven away from Oklahoma with nothing. They were sitting on the top rail of the south fence, watching the sun go down behind a mesa line to the west, the sky doing its extraordinary thing with color, the cattle settling in the pasture below them, the first crickets starting up in the grass. He said it simply, without preamble or performance, the way a man says a true thing when he has finally stopped being afraid of it. She looked at him for a moment with those steady, clear eyes. "I know," she said. "I've been waiting for you to catch up." He laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind he hadn't heard come out of himself in longer than he could remember. It rose up and went out across the quiet pasture, and the cattle raised their heads briefly at the unfamiliar sound, and then went back to grazing. Roy sold him the first 40% of Crosshatch that October, on the anniversary of the partnership agreement, at exactly the price they had agreed upon. He handed Caleb the deed on the porch after supper with the same economy of gesture he brought to everything, and said only, "Your grandfather would recognize you," which was not something Roy could have known about Caleb's grandfather, but which landed with the precision of an arrow finding the exact center of something. Caleb held the deed in both hands and looked at it for a long time. His name on a piece of land in Texas. Not the land he was born to. Not the land his grandfather had driven the first fence post into with a sledgehammer and a stubborn will. That land was gone and would not come back, and he had made his peace with that, the way a man makes peace with the permanent things, not by forgetting them, but by carrying them differently, not as wounds, but as weight that had shaped him, as the specific gravity of a particular life. This was different land, his own, in a way that the things we choose are ours more completely than the things we simply inherit. May called him that Sunday and asked if the farm was really his now. 40% of it, he said. That's almost half, she said, with the confident arithmetic of a child who has done the calculation and found it sufficient. It is, he agreed. Daddy, she said, and her voice had gone quiet in the way it did when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for a while. I told my teacher about the ranch. She asked if I wanted to write about it for the class project, about you starting over. He was quiet for a moment. What did you write? He asked. I wrote that you lost everything, she said. But you didn't stop, and that's why you found something better. The October wind moved through the ranch yard outside the bunkhouse window, carried with it the smell of dry grass and the faint sweetness of the season turning. The cattle were settled in the south pasture. The barn light cast its yellow square on the caliche ground. Somewhere along the fence line, a meadowlark sang its last song of the evening, bright and insistent and alive. Caleb Hurst sat in the place that was becoming his and listened to his daughter's voice and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the ground beneath him was solid, not borrowed, not temporary, not about to be taken. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that losing everything isn't always the end, sometimes it's just the beginning, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are more stories like Caleb's waiting for you.